For 22 years, most people believed the Laci Peterson case was closed. Scott Peterson was convicted. The story was over. But in 2026, a wave of new filings, a two-part documentary, and a court ruling that runs 116 pages have dragged the case back into the headlines, and what surfaced is messier, and in some ways more disturbing, than anyone expected. Not because it proves Scott Peterson is innocent. Not because it proves he's guilty. But because it shows how hard it still is, more than 2 decades later, to get a straight answer. Laci Peterson was 27 years old and 8 months pregnant with her first child when she disappeared from her home on Covina Avenue in Modesto, California, on December 24, 2002. She and her husband Scott had been married 5 years. They were expecting a boy, already named Connor. By all accounts from friends and family, Laci was warm, organized, and counting down the days to her due date. Scott told police he left home that morning to go fishing alone at the Berkeley Marina, roughly 90 miles away, in San Francisco Bay near Brooks Island. When he returned that afternoon, Laci was gone. Her family reported her missing that night. Within days, the disappearance became a national story. Television crews camped outside the Peterson home. And then came the detail that changed everything in the court of public opinion. Scott had been having an affair with a massage therapist named Amber Frey, whom he'd told he was a widower. When that surfaced in January 2003, the story shifted from missing pregnant woman to husband with a secret almost overnight. Laci's and Connor's remains washed ashore in San Francisco Bay in April 2003, not far from the marina where Scott said he'd been fishing. He was arrested that same month near San Diego, and in November 2004 a jury convicted him of first-degree murder for Laci and second-degree murder for Connor. He was sentenced to death. In 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned that sentence over errors in jury selection, and in 2021 he was resentenced to life in prison without parole, where he remains today. For most of the public, that was the end of it. It wasn't. It's worth pausing on what the prosecution's case looked like in 2004, because the 2026 fight is really a fight over how solid that original foundation was. Prosecutors argued Scott killed Laci inside their home, transported her body to the marina in his truck, and dumped her from a boat he had purchased shortly before her disappearance, using homemade concrete anchors. No blood, tissue, or other physical evidence tying Laci to a violent crime was found in the house, the truck, or the boat. The only physical link recovered from the boat was 2 strands of hair found under a seat. The prosecution built much of its circumstantial case instead around the affair with Amber Frey, Scott's changed appearance and behavior around the time of his arrest. He had dyed his hair, was carrying his brother's identification, a large amount of cash, and camping gear when he was taken into custody near a golf course in San Diego. And expert testimony about ocean currents and fetal development that tied the location and timing of the discovery of the bodies back to Scott's account of his own movements. The jury found that circumstantial case convincing enough to convict on both counts. What the current appeal effort argues is that 2 of those expert pillars, the hydrological modeling of where a body would drift and the fetal growth-based dating of Connor's death, don't hold up as well under today's methods as they did to a jury in 2004. That's the crux of the dispute, and it's a genuinely technical one that reasonable experts can and do disagree about. In 2023, the Los Angeles Innocence Project, a non-profit legal organization based at Loyola Law School that investigates claims of wrongful conviction, took on Scott Peterson's case. It wasn't his first attempt to reopen things. Since 2004, he has filed a motion for a new trial, a direct appeal, for requests for post-conviction DNA testing, and multiple habeas corpus petitions, all of which had previously failed. But this time the organization said it had assembled what it called substantial new evidence, and in August 2025 it filed a 3rd petition for a writ of habeas corpus in San Mateo County Superior Court, laying out 14 separate claims. 2 pieces of that filing became the centerpiece of the renewed public interest in the case. At trial, prosecution witness Dr. Gregory DeVore testified about the estimated gestational age of Connor's remains, using fetal measurement data available at the time, and the state argued this placed his death close to the morning Laci disappeared, which meant close to the window before Scott left for the marina. The Los Angeles Innocence Project's petition argues that the fetal growth standards used at trial were outdated and that newer growth chart research, developed years after the 2004 trial, would put Connor's estimated date of death later than what the jury heard. If a later window is correct, the defense argues, that undercuts the prosecution's core timeline, since it would mean Laci was potentially still alive after Scott left home that morning. This is a genuine, if familiar, argument for the defense. It isn't new to 2025. Chris Pixley, a former defense attorney who has been involved in re-examining the case and who appears in A&E's recent documentary on it, has argued publicly that the reliability of expert scientific testimony matters regardless of one's view of guilt or innocence, pointing out, as he told interviewers, that a verdict isn't reliable if the jury's expert testimony wasn't reliable either. The second major thread involves the Petersons' neighbors, the Medina family, whose home directly across Covina Avenue was burglarized around the same time Laci vanished. A safe, jewelry, guns, and tools were taken. 2 men were later arrested in connection with that burglary. The Los Angeles Innocence Project's petition has argued that the timing and proximity of that burglary deserve closer scrutiny than they received at trial, and has pointed to a stolen van found burned about a mile away the day after Laci was reported missing, with a mattress inside that reportedly tested presumptively positive for blood. The organization has suggested that Laci may have interrupted the burglary and that this deserved to be investigated as a possible alternate explanation. It's worth being precise here about what's actually established versus what's alleged. Investigators who worked the original case have publicly pushed back on this theory over the years, and prosecutors have maintained the burglary was unconnected and occurred after Laci had already disappeared, since both men arrested were said to have committed the crime on December 26. The burglary theory has been part of the public conversation around this case for years. It isn't a brand new discovery in 2026, but it's being foregrounded again now with more detail than before. That renewed attention crystallized in July 2026, when A&E premiered a 2-part documentary special, Scott Peterson, The New Evidence, on July 16. It features Pixley, retired Los Angeles Police Department Detective Nanette Tuzby, and Scott's original trial attorney, Mark Garagos, walking through the Innocence Project's claims. Garagos, who has represented Peterson since the original trial, told a crowd at CrimeCon in Las Vegas in May 2026 that he doesn't believe Scott is capable of the crime he was convicted of. Laci's family has responded publicly and firmly. Her mother, Sharon Rocha, has rejected the documentary's premise and said no genuinely new evidence exists, a position she's held through years of these renewed filings, during which, according to prosecutors, she has had to sit through hearing after hearing. The documentary itself doesn't claim to resolve the case. It largely functions as an extended walkthrough of the Innocence Project's petition, presented through the perspective of people already sympathetic to Peterson's cause. Pixley, Tuzby, and Garagos have all worked, in different capacities, to get his conviction overturned. That doesn't make their arguments wrong, but it does mean the documentary is best understood as advocacy journalism rather than a neutral investigation, and it's worth watching with that in mind. Prosecutors were not shy about making that point either, framing the special as a marketing exercise built to draw viewers rather than a genuine re-examination of the trial record. Part of what makes this dispute so hard to referee from the outside is that both sides are technically using the same phrase, new evidence, to mean different things. For the Los Angeles Innocence Project, new evidence means updated scientific methodology applied to old physical measurements, newer fetal growth data, newer approaches to modeling water currents and object drift, and witness accounts the organization argues were never adequately pursued at the time. None of that is new in the sense of previously unknown or newly discovered facts about the case. It's new in the sense that the tools and standards used to interpret existing facts have moved on since 2004. For prosecutors, that distinction matters enormously, and it's central to why Judge Hill's ruling went the way it did. In post-conviction habeas proceedings, courts generally require genuinely new, previously unavailable evidence, not a fresh reanalysis of information the defense already had the opportunity to challenge at trial. The Stanislaus County District Attorney's Office has argued that reinterpreting old data with newer statistical models doesn't meet that bar, and that most of the claims in the 2025 petition had, in some form, already been raised in Peterson's direct appeal or in earlier post-conviction filings. That's the recycled, repackaged, and rebranded language the DA's office used, and it's the framework the judge appears to have applied in rejecting all 14 claims. The Innocence Project's counterargument is that this framework itself is being applied too rigidly, that dismissing updated forensic science as merely recycled, because it touches on issues raised at trial risks freezing wrongful conviction review at the state of science that existed 20 years ago, no matter how much that science has since been revised. Deputy Director Hannah Brown has said the ruling reflects a broader misunderstanding of how habeas law is supposed to work, which is precisely the argument the organization plans to make to a higher court. Here's where the story sharpens into something more uncomfortable than a straightforward vindication narrative, because the headline outcome of 2026 isn't that new evidence freed Scott Peterson, or even that a court agreed the evidence was compelling. It's that a judge rejected the petition entirely. On April 27, 2026, San Mateo County Superior Court Judge Elizabeth Hill denied Peterson's third habeas corpus petition in full, all 14 claims, in a 116-page ruling. Stanislaus County District Attorney Jeff Logero, whose office opposed the petition, said the judge recognized the filing for what his office argued it was, recycled, repackaged arguments rather than genuinely new evidence, adding that no credible new evidence had been presented and that the conviction had now been upheld through 2 decades of post-conviction litigation. The Los Angeles Innocence Project disagrees sharply with that characterization. The organization's deputy director, Hannah Brown, said the ruling reflected a misunderstanding of habeas corpus law and argued that the court had improperly disregarded evidence as inadmissible when it should have been considered under a different legal standard. LAIP Director Paula Mitchell has echoed that criticism, saying habeas proceedings are complex and often misapplied at the superior court level. The organization has said it intends to appeal Judge Hill's decision to a higher court. Separately, Peterson also has a pending appeal before the California Supreme Court concerning an earlier juror misconduct claim, the allegation that a juror gave false answers on her jury questionnaire, a claim that had already been the subject of a 2022 evidentiary hearing, at which the court found the jurors' inaccurate answers were unintentional and non-prejudicial. So as of mid-2026, the actual legal status of the case is this: the conviction stands. Every post-conviction challenge Peterson has filed, the motion for a new trial, the direct appeal, for DNA testing requests, and now 3 habeas petitions, has been denied. What's changed is that the arguments are more detailed, more publicized, and now backed by a national television platform, and the fight is moving to a higher court. That's the part of this story that's genuinely uncomfortable, regardless of which side of the case you find more persuasive. It isn't that a shocking twist proved Scott Peterson didn't do it, and it isn't that a smoking gun proved definitively that he did. What 2026 actually revealed is something less satisfying and, in its own way, more troubling. A system in which a case can generate a 116-page ruling, a 903-page prosecutorial response according to the DA's office, a national documentary, statements from a grieving family, and competing legal teams, and still leave the public no closer to a shared understanding of what happened on December 24, 2002. Logero has pointed out that a documentary can be edited and marketed to tell whatever story draws the most viewers, but that it can't change what the evidentiary record shows or undo what a jury and, now, a reviewing judge have already decided. That's a fair point about the limits of documentary storytelling. But it's also fair to note that the Los Angeles Innocence Project isn't a random production company. It's a legal organization that investigates wrongful conviction claims for a living, and its objection isn't really about the documentary. It's about whether the legal standard for reviewing new evidence was applied correctly. Both things can be true at once. The ruling can reflect a careful, thorough review of the record, and the fight over what counts as new evidence in a habeas proceeding can still be a genuinely contested legal question that a higher court may see differently. That tension, a family that has waited over 20 years for the case to simply stay closed, an inmate and his legal team who say the underlying science was wrong, and a court system built to make finality difficult to overturn even when it might be worth revisiting, is the actual worse than we thought of this story. Not a hidden villain. A structural one, the discomfort of not knowing whether a legal system optimized for finality is still capable of correcting itself decades later, or whether it simply becomes harder to argue with the passage of time, however credible the argument. The renewed coverage has split online audiences roughly the way it did in 2003 and 2004, only louder, because the internet in 2026 amplifies true crime content differently than cable news did 2 decades ago. True crime podcasts and YouTube channels picked the documentary apart within days of its release, some treating the burglary theory and the revised fetal dating estimates as compelling reasons to doubt the conviction, others pointing out that a defense-funded organization presenting its own petition's contents is not the same thing as independent confirmation that the original verdict was wrong. Commentary from retired law enforcement figures not involved in the case has been similarly split, with some arguing the original investigation moved too quickly towards Scott as a suspect once the affair became public, and others noting that circumstantial cases are convicted every day in California courts and that a documentary revisiting expert testimony doesn't amount to proof of a different outcome. What's notable is how little of that public debate has actually engaged with a narrow legal question the courts are wrestling with, whether the petition met the specific evidentiary bar habeas law requires, as opposed to the broader question of whether Scott Peterson did it. Those are different arguments, and conflating them is part of why this case keeps generating heat without generating resolution. A judge can rule that a legal filing didn't meet a procedural standard for reopening a case without that ruling functioning as a fresh, independent verdict on guilt, and an appellate court could, in theory, reach a different conclusion about the standard itself without ever revisiting the underlying facts a jury weighed in 2004. The Los Angeles Innocence Project has said it will pursue its appeal of Judge Hill's ruling to a higher court, and Peterson's separate juror misconduct appeal remains pending before the California Supreme Court. Neither path guarantees a new trial, and California's appellate courts have historically set a high bar for reopening a conviction of this age. Prosecutors, for their part, have signaled they intend to keep opposing every filing with the same posture they've held for 2 decades, that the jury got it right the first time, and that no filing since has changed that. Sharon Roche's question, "When will this end?" remains unanswered, and may remain unanswered for a while longer. Scott Peterson,